A low wind carried dust across the prairie, sweeping over the dry grass in long sighs, as if the land itself were tired. The sky hung in a flat, pressing gray that seemed to dim the color from everything it touched. Down the fence line came a woman in a faded blue dress, the hem darkened from miles of dirt road, her boots leaving uneven prints in the hard earth. She carried only a small, weather-worn satchel, its strap cutting into the curve of her shoulder. Her hair, dark, untamed, caught now and then in the wind, flashing across her face before she tucked it back with a work-worn hand. The house rose at the end of the path, 2 stories of weathered timber, with a wide porch that looked out toward miles of open nothing. When she reached the steps, she stopped. Her fingers hovered over the railing, as though touching it might set something in motion she couldn't undo. She stood there long enough for the wind to tug at her dress, for dust to gather at the toes of her boots. Then she climbed the steps, stood before the door, and counted 3 breaths before knocking. The sound was small against the quiet. When the door opened, the man who stood there filled it, tall, broad, the lines on his face carved as much by weather as by time. His eyes were the pale blue of sky before a storm, and they regarded her without hurry. "I'm looking for work," she began, her voice steady but carrying the edges of something frayed. "Cooking, cleaning, tending stock, I'm able. I can sleep in the barn if need be." She kept her gaze level, though it cost her something. "I've been turned away in town," they said. Her breath caught, but she pressed on. "They said a miner's widow with no family's not the kind they'll hire." Elias McKenna didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the porch boards with a hollow sound, and somewhere in the distance, a hinge creaked. His hand stayed on the doorframe, his shadow cast long over her boots. "I've no work for hire," he said finally, his voice deep but without edge. She nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, and turned, her satchel brushing her hip. She stepped into the yard, the dirt shifting under her heels. Her boot caught in a soft patch of mud where last week's rain had lingered, and she bent slightly to pull it free. The wind lifted her hair again, and for the first time, Elias saw her face unshielded, pale from travel, eyes sharper than her thin frame suggested. Something in that sight made him speak again. "Wait!" She turned, wary. "It's late," he said. "You can stay the night. There's a spare room." The relief didn't show in her face, but it shifted her posture, loosening her shoulders as she followed him inside. The air in the house was warm, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and something stewed earlier in the day. He gestured toward the table, where a plate sat empty beside a cooling pot. She removed her satchel, setting it carefully at her feet, and took the seat without fuss. He ladled stew into a bowl and set it before her, without speaking. She ate with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had learned to make every bite count. Her spoon scraped the bottom quietly. He sat opposite her, elbows resting lightly on the table, watching in a way that wasn't unkind but seemed to be measuring something. The lamp between them flickered, throwing shadows across his face and catching in the steam from her bowl. When she finished, she murmured a thanks, her voice quieter than when she'd arrived. He nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I can't pay you wages," he said after a long moment, "but I can offer you a place, food, a roof, and my protection if you'll take my name." His tone carried no warmth of proposal, only the steady weight of practicality, as if he were offering a contract instead of a promise. She looked at him, searching his face for something she couldn't name. The lamp hissed faintly in the stillness between them, and somewhere outside, the wind shifted, rattling the porch boards again. Morning frost clung to the fence rails like thin glass, catching the weak light of dawn. Mara stood near the coop in Elias's coat, the sleeves hanging past her wrists, her breath lifting in pale clouds as she scattered feed to the chickens. The ground was hard beneath her boots, the kind of cold that seeped upward into the bones. From the porch, Elias watched without speaking, one hand resting on the post, his face unreadable against the pale-as-bone sky. Inside the house, the air always seemed to carry the weight of someone else's life. Hattie McKenna's presence lingered in every room. Her shawl draped over the back of a chair, a Bible open on the table as if she might return to finish reading. Mara moved carefully, touching nothing that wasn't hers. She worked in silence, cleaning, cooking, sweeping the wide plank floors until the light shifted in the windows, and it was time to start supper. Now and then, small exchanges bridged the quiet. A torn shirt left folded on the edge of her bed. She mended it in the evening, her stitches neat and even. The next morning, a cup of coffee sat waiting on the counter, still warm, though she hadn't heard him set it there. No words accompanied these offerings, just a mutual understanding that some gestures were best left unexplained. When they went into town for supplies, the air shifted. Outside the mercantile, Deputy Cole leaned against the hitch rail, his eyes narrowing slightly as they approached. "Didn't think you were the kind to replace Hattie so soon, Elias," he said, his voice mild but carrying enough to be heard. Mara kept her face still, her hands tightening around the basket she carried. Elias didn't answer, just brushed past, the weight of his silence louder than any retort. Back at the ranch, he said nothing about it, but later she heard the sharp thud of an axe biting into wood. She watched from the kitchen window as he split log after log, stacking them neatly by the side of the house. By dusk, a fresh pile of firewood stood by her door, covered against the snow that was threatening in the clouds. The storm came in sudden, hard gusts that drove icy air through every crack in the barn. They worked side by side to bring the animals in from the far pasture, their breath ragged in the wind. Mara's skirt caught in the snow and mud, but she yanked it free and kept moving, rope in hand, coaxing a stubborn mule toward shelter. Snow stung her cheeks, tangled in her hair, but she didn't slow. Elias saw it, the grit in her, the refusal to yield, and something in his gaze shifted, softened. By the time the last animal was safe inside, the world beyond the barn doors had vanished into white. They trudged back through the snow in silence, shoulders brushing now and then, the wind howling around them. That night, the storm rattled the windows while the two of them sat by the fire, bowls of stew warming their hands. The room smelled of meat and herbs, and somewhere beneath it, the clean, faint scent of cedar. When they finished eating, Elias left the room, and returned with a folded quilt. He placed it on the back of her chair. "It was my mother's," he said simply. When she carried it to her room later, she pressed it briefly to her face. The cedar scent lingered there, warm and steady, like something meant to last. The sound of hoofbeats broke the frostbitten silence, sharp against the still air. Mara stepped onto the porch, her breath curling white in the morning cold. Down the lane, 3 riders approached. Deputy Cole at the front, 2 townsmen flanking him. Their coats were buttoned high, their hats pulled low against the wind. Behind her, the door opened. She felt Elias step out, his shadow falling long over hers, stretching across the porch boards toward the riders. They reined in at the gate. Cole's eyes flicked from Mara to Elias, and when he spoke, his voice carried easily across the short distance. "Word is you've taken a woman who's got no claim to be here. Some folks are saying she's after more than a roof, after your land, McKenna." He leaned slightly in the saddle. "There's talk of petition." Elias didn't answer. The cold made the air brittle, and the silence between them was sharp enough to splinter. Mara could feel it, the weight of eyes in the saddle, the wind tugging at her skirt, the memory of every door closed to her in town. Before Elias could speak, she stepped forward. "I didn't come for his land," she said, her voice clear despite the tightness in her throat. "I came for a day's work. He gave me more than I asked for." Cole's gaze lingered on her, measuring. "Hattie wouldn't have approved," he said, turning his words toward Elias now. The name landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. Elias's stillness didn't break, but the air around him seemed to change. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, unshaken. "This is my home," he said, "and she bears my name. That's all the right you'll get." Something in that tone, final, immovable, closed the matter more than any law could. Cole shifted in his saddle, looked as if he might say more, but instead tugged his reins. The other 2 followed suit. Hoofbeats receded down the lane, carried off by the wind until the sound was gone. They stood on the porch a moment longer, watching the empty road. Mara turned to speak, but Elias's eyes stopped her mid-breath. "Don't," he said simply, as if thanks were a thing better left unsaid. He stepped off the porch and crossed to the barn. She followed, the air inside warmer, filled with the soft smell of hay. At the far stall stood a bay mare, ears twitching as Elias approached. He took the reins from the post and turned to her. "Yours now," he said, holding them out. She hesitated, then reached for them. Her fingers brushed his. Just a small touch, but neither of them moved away. The space between them seemed to hold more than the barn walls could contain. The offer he had made weeks ago, blunt and practical, no longer felt like a bargain struck out of necessity. It felt earned. She stood there with the reins in her hands, the mare shifting softly beside her, and for a moment the wind outside was just wind, not a thing to fear. Sometimes the world will measure you by whispers and weather, testing whether you'll bow or stand. But there are doors worth knocking on, and names worth carrying, not for what they give you, but for how they keep you standing when the wind comes.